Welcome back. We are going on to learning outcome 3 now, in which we are going to be looking more specifically at the Mika Bell reading, which is from pages 52 to 58 of your Narratological Theory textbook. Please make sure you do read that and you have gone through that before I start talking, mostly because this will get quite complicated if you haven't tried to engage with that content before now. Um, what I will say before we even start going through too much of the content is the fact that this should be familiar, because we have talked about embedded narratives from your semester 1. And this is the content that we have talked about in terms of how stories are framed. So embedded narratives should not be completely outside of your frame of reference. This should be fairly familiar. I am going to go through it because I think that it's necessary just to remind you about how stories can be put within one another. So I wanted to first start off with sometimes to students I explain it as a matryoshka doll, or sometimes I explain it as a curtain, as I'm doing here. What I want you to remember about an embedded narrative is that it is a story within a story. So what we're looking at here, and a reason I've chosen this image to sort of highlight the point here, is that we are looking at a story being told through the eyes of another story, or told through the perspective of another storyteller. So what we have here, just to sort of put this in context, is that we have a story told by Vladek of his and his wife's experiences in Dachau and Auschwitz, respectively, that is then told told Vladek to his son Art, who then is drawing it through his perspective, as well as referring to his own relationship with his father. So it's quite complex. So the aim of framing a text within a text is to make us be aware that these texts are very constructed. So what is happening here is that when we have one text on top of another or within another, we have the ability to be incredibly critical of the lens through which we are looking at the original story. So what I've got here is I've got a specific comment from one of the pages, which is interesting because it's a discussion between Art, where he's obviously here. This is Art Spiegelman, who is our artist, and also one of our main characters, and he's talking to Marla. Marla is the stepmother, and she has married Art's father, Vladek, after his wife has committed suicide. And Spiegelman Art, our main character here, is saying to Marla, he's saying, it's something that worries me about the book I'm doing about him. In some ways, he's just like the racist caricature of the miserly old Jew. And she responds with, ha, you can say that again. So what you have here at this point in time is that you have Art Spiegelman as the artist drawing himself as the character of Art Spiegelman, who is Vladek's son. And he is talking to his now fictional, in this version, stepmother, saying that he's worried about the way that he's portraying Vladek, because he's scared that the way that he's portraying Vladek is going to make him look like very miserly, meaning that he's withholding money and doesn't want to spend it. He's racist, and he's an old Jewish man, and he's a caricature rather than a person. So what we have here is an incredibly self-aware moment, and this is a great example of postmodernism being very self-aware of itself, where it's going, ha, I know that I am a story, I know that I'm a storyteller, and I'm worried that the way that I'm telling the story is not going to effectively convey something to you, because I might make someone seem like something that they are not. So I might make Vladek seem like a miserly old Jew, even though he isn't really that, maybe. And he isn't a racist. He might have his own survival struggles, his PTSD, which makes him the character that he is. So what I've done here is I've done a little illustration to sort of help you understand. And this is what we have, is we have the first layer, which is our embedded text, which is the survivor's story by Anya and Vladek. So Anya is dead in the current storytelling, although she is alive during the survivor story in Germany. Complex that. So Anya is Vladek's wife and Art's mother, and we are seeing Vladek tell their story. So the first part is that it's their getting together story, which is almost romantic. And then we have him telling the story of them trying to survive through, in the case of Vladek, Auschwitz. As far as I understand, if I remember correctly, Anya is in Dachau, which is another one of the concentration camps. We then have our next layer, which is Vladek is telling us these stories. So what we have is Vladek is telling these stories, and sometimes we see him as a younger version of himself, where he's telling the story to Art in his sort of more youthful version, and we then have him in his much older version, where he's also telling a story. So you will see that he jumps in ages depending on where in the story we are, and sometimes it's not chronological at all. And then on top of it, we have Art listening to these recordings and drawing the story into the form of MAUS. So what we have is we have our embedded text here, and then we have our fabula. Now you can look at these two as two separate fabulas, or you can look at them as sort of one hybrid fabula. I like to keep them separate because I think that it's interesting to remember that we have the story of Anya and Vladek. We have Vladek's version of the story that he is telling to Art. And then we have Art's impressions of how the story was told and retold to him with his own impressions of the relationship that he has with his father, as well as he has with other people in his life on top of that. So I personally think that there are three layers of the story. You can easily sort of reduce it to two, where you have Vladek telling the story of Anya and himself, and then you have Art retelling the story through the graphic novel formats. But it is important to just remember that everyone that is telling a story, we are looking at it through their perspective and their eyes. And Vladek's voice is the dominant one in the narrative. Although a lot of the scenes that we're going to see that I'm going to point out to you are the more self-aware ones where Art is present, you're going to see a lot of moments as well where Vladek is the primary voice, where he's retelling his story. And Art is more like a voice that sort of floats over the narrative. So, why is the story embedded? What is the point? Why do we frame a story within another story? And the first thing that it does is it allows us to check that there might be motivation behind the storytelling. What is the motivation behind telling your own story or behind telling someone else's story? And one of the things we need to assess as the readers and the audience of this is, what is the motive for Art Spiegelman in telling his family's tragedy in MAUS? Why is he telling this story? And this is something that you should really sort of sit down and think about, is why would somebody tell a story like this? A story that, as Adorno says, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. This is a very difficult content to engage with. It's very emotive. It's very challenging. It's one of the most historically impactful moments that is still resonating with the world. And it's something we haven't really gotten over. And he is telling the story with a very critical lens over one of the survivors. When we look at the way that Vladek is characterized, he is not characterized as a sweet little old survivor who we need to protect and cherish, but he's portrayed in a very honest version of himself, which is incredibly traumatized, but also not necessarily a very nice man. So what is the motive? What do you think the motivation is behind Spiegelman telling the story? I would argue that one of the things that you need to consider is the need to heal. This is a story where post-traumatic stress disorder is resonating throughout. And not only is it post-traumatic stress from the character of Vladek and Anya, but also this post-traumatic stress that has sort of imparted itself onto Art Spiegelman himself. He, as a young man growing up in a Jewish setting after World War II and the Holocaust, would never have been able to escape the tragedy that has occurred to him and his family. His life would have been overshadowed by these events, no matter what he did, and no matter how much he tried to escape the situation. It is inevitable that he would have experienced the second-hand trauma. So, oops. One of the greatest things that we have here to embedding a narrative is that we do not need to disassociate this artist from the experience in creating their artwork. And what is very convenient here is that by embedding the narrative the way he does, we don't have to separate art out from the art. we don't have to separate art out, sorry. What I'm trying to say is we don't need to separate Spiegelman himself out of his art. We can see how the impact of the art has impacted on him as a person. So the things that we need to look at here is how the PTSD and the secondhand trauma is very present in both the story, but also in the way that Art Spiegelman is telling the story. These images that he's talking about, he may not have seen them firsthand, but there's no way that these very traumatizing images would not have been part of his life from his very birth, because this narrative of trauma has been sort of running along his family because of what has happened in World War II. The second thing that he's doing here is he's chronicling for an entire community while preserving a personal history. And he's not only telling the story of himself and Vladek, and something to note is that this book was only published and really started after Vladek had died. And it's important to note that, because does Spiegelman tell the story after his father has died to deal with that trauma, to try and move past that trauma? Or is he trying to, is there a little bit of a sneaky little nudge with his elbow where he's saying, now because my father has passed and that trauma is not really with me so much presently, I can now tell the story more honestly. I'm not held back by any reservations my father had and things that he wouldn't have wanted me to say. And there is definitely the impact, or the thing that we need to note here, of although he is chronicling for an entire community, he's telling a story because there would have been people that would never have been able to tell the story, even though they had lived through it. So the way he's trying to tell the story is not just for the benefit of himself, but anybody else who experienced the same traumas. Here is the next thing that I think is important to think about motivation, is that the process of growing up with the experience of having survivors as parents and having his mother commit suicide in 1968 when he was very young. I mean, he would have been 20 at the time. The impact of that would have been resounding in his life. And she didn't leave a note, though there is theories that she committed suicide out of survivor's guilt. One of the things you need to consider here is that although she had survivor's guilt, how does that impact upon him? He is a second-hand survivor of this, and had they not had survived, he wouldn't be around. And how is he processing these emotions? And so what he's doing is, by layering his story, by embedding his father within his own narrative, he's trying to account for this. He's trying to say, they survived this trauma, and I can tell their story on a very superficial level, or I can show you the consequences of such violence on an entire community for generations to come. I'm telling the story 40 years later, and the harm is still here, the damage is still present, and the trauma is never ending. And there's a statement at one point where it says that Anya never left Dachau. She relived it constantly. And there is something to note about that. There is something to note about the fact that there is this idea that the trauma, you may not physically be in it, but the trauma that you experienced in this moment is still resonating. And then lastly, something to keep in mind for motivation is that one of the things that came out of the end of World War II, and it is the motivating statement, and it still is the motivating statement for the UN, is the statement, never again. We will never again see this happen. And that is part of what Spiegelman is trying to say, is he's saying, we let this happen once. If I don't tell my story, and I don't tell the story of my family and what has happened, it will happen again. Obviously, the tragedy is that it has happened again. We have had genocide since, never to the same successful extent. And I say successful with inverted commas, please don't misinterpret that. I'm saying no one has yet been as successful to exterminate so severely as many people as Hitler did. But we still have this need for getting rid of the other that has never really left. And there are still groups of people who do this. And that is not that narrative is still very present. The hope here with creating MAUS is that if we create enough awareness, hopefully it won't happen again. However, I know it would be something to keep in mind. Look what is happening in America today. So there is a second level of embedding. We do not just have the embedding of Vladek's story in Art Spiegelman's story. So we don't just have Art Spiegelman's motivation, but we also have Vladek's motivation. So he is retelling his and Anya's experiences from World War II. What are Vladek's motivations? Something to think about here is it's so easy to keep in mind what Spiegelman is trying to do. It's very easy to sort of see through very clearly what our very strong authorial voice is trying to say. But we may not, or we might be missing the secondary layer that Vladek is telling a story. And what is the story that he's trying to tell? And why is he trying to tell his own story? Why is he willing to tell the story from his own perspective? So what I want to do now here, because I've asked that question, I want you to have this conversation and discuss this as a paragraph in which you briefly discuss what you think Vladek's motivation for telling his story to his son. Why do you think he has this motivation? It should be in the form of a short paragraph, and you can reference specific scenes in the graphic novel to support your claims. I've put here one that's a good idea, and a good little moment here, which says, and it's a conversation between Art and his father Vladek, but it's about Mala and him, and it says, maybe you should both see a marriage counselor. And here Vladek says, I don't want a stranger should mix into our private stories. I don't want that a stranger should mix into our private stories. And I want you to think about what that implies about Vladek. Why is he telling such powerful stories that are so damaging to his son? Why is he willingly telling these stories, knowing that his son is going to use this for material to publish? And he knows because Vladek is recording most of these sessions where he sits down. He doesn't just sit and draw, he actually records with a voice recorder. So why is he so willing to tell these stories when here, in this moment here, we have him saying, I don't want you to be involved in our private stories. So what do you think Vladek's motivation for telling his story is? We know what Spiegelman's stories are. We know why Art is trying to engage with this through his own secondhand trauma and awareness and so on. But what do you think Vladek's are? And I'm not saying that they are different, but I do want you to keep in mind that they might be slightly different because of the first versus second-hand experiences. Okay, so one of the things that we need to think about here is that the primary fabula can be used to explain the embedded text. And this is something that Mika Bell explains. And I think it's on page 52 or 53, might be even 54. And the argument here is that sometimes you will have the fabula, which is Art's commentary on top of the story. So Art's conversation with his father. Those scenes are sometimes used to explain what is going on in the scenes with Vladek. So here, as I've said, Spiegelman is using the opportunity to lay his own commentary over the story. He's using them to retell moments, or he's using them to frame scenes for us. And here, there are two scenes here that I think are quite important to think about here. So the one here is the first moment is a conversation between his father, Vladek, and Art. Art, you can see, is angry because of the little almost sweat beads coming off him and then the very cross eyebrow. And we can see that Vladek is looking despairing because his head is in his hands. And he's saying here, I cannot forget it. Ever since Hitler, I don't like to throw out even a crumb. Now remember I said to you that during World War II, during the Holocaust, starvation was another means to kill people. And here we have Spiegelman saying, just save the damn Special K in case Hitler ever comes back. And here what you have is you have a young person who's obviously not experienced the same level of trauma, using the trauma of their parents against them because he's so angry at how frustrated he is about his father not willing to throw away even the last bit of the cereal because he's so desperate and miserly and holding on to everything. And here what you have is you have another scene in which there is a statement, again, you can see how cross our character is with a very angry eyebrows and saying he's more attached to things than to people. And this is again about Vladek, about saying how desperate he is to hold on to physical possessions rather than the people in his life. And often there are scenes in the narrative where Vladek seems to push Art away. He doesn't want to seem very attached and close to his son, and he's very obsessional about money and about looking after things and caring for the physical objects in his surroundings. And what this is doing is, what we have here is, in the embedded text, which is the story that Vladek is telling, we're seeing the trauma firsthand. We're seeing the stories of people treating each other badly in Auschwitz. We're seeing the stories of how atrocious the guards were when the mass slaughters were occurring and how Vladek survived during this time. And then what we're seeing here is when we have this overlying narrative where Art is speaking about scenes with his father, at where he is as an adult very frustrated by his father, what we're seeing is we're seeing the longitudinal study of that trauma of Auschwitz 40 years later. So what we have here is this commentary, these scenes, which are in modern America, are used to explain the extent of the emotional status and the trauma that Vladek has undergone, but also the secondhand trauma that is reflecting onto Art and how he is experiencing this trauma from his father, and how sometimes it becomes really awful because he uses it as a way to attack his father. It becomes a weak spot that he knows that he can prod back. You know, we all know this, how awful we can be to family members when we know the one thing that is vulnerable for them. And something that you should also think about here is that not only is he using to explain the longevity and the longitudinal pain that these people endured during the Holocaust and World War II, we also can look at how this frames Spiegelman as more of a human narrator. We learn to trust Spiegelman because he sometimes puts himself as a negative light. And this is one of those moments where actually Vladek could have been portrayed as a bit of a miser, but instead what we see is he is expressing his own trauma, and instead of handling it well because he understands the trauma, we have this young man, Art Spiegelman, reacting because he's probably heard the statement so many times before, and he cannot understand how this trauma is still resonating so powerfully with his father. So what we have is the embedded text being explained by the fabula. So the overlaying narrative that Art has here, where he talks about scenes in modern America, by contrast to the 1940s Poland, we have this explanation of the future and the consequences, and the explanation of why his father behaves the way he does. The next thing that we need to think about here, and this is posed by Mika Bell, is that when the story of the embedded text is being told, is it possible to change the consequences or the effects of the event? Or is the event itself changeable? So if you're telling a story within a story, is the story on the inside changeable by the story on the outside? And in this case, we obviously know not, because in this case, we have there's not only a huge time period, but this is nonfiction, so this is a story that cannot be changed. But we also have this idea that Art himself is retelling the story, and he can't change the events because he is separate from it. So the situation itself is unchangeable. But what is interesting to look at is sometimes the way that the story is told can be changed. So we've got this little scene here at the bottom, as I'm referencing here, is that, so what is happening is here's the conversation, and we see Art holding his little microphone, and he's talking to his father, and his father says, "When we were in the ghetto in 1943, Tosha, took all the children to," and then he's broken off because, yeah, Art is stopping him, and he's saying, "Wait, please, Dad, if you don't keep your story in chronological order, I'll never get it straight. Tell me more about 1941 and 1942. So what we have here is that all the events of the story cannot be changed, and they are stuck and cast in stone. We have these characters who are retelling the story to us, who are telling it to us in broken bits and pieces, and sometimes they're telling us in the wrong order, and sometimes that is quite frustrating for our storyteller because he wants to put it in a neat, nice bracket for us to look at and go, okay, this is point one, this is point two, this is year one, this is year two, this is year three. And instead, what you have is his dad recalling these histories in bits and pieces, sometimes because maybe he doesn't want to relive a specific traumatic moment in a specific time. So, how do these layers have a relationship to one another? So technically, because there is no changing of the original events, do they have an influence on the fabula? So does the embedded text have an effect on the fabula? And something to think about is the fact that this would be very simple if this was a modernist text or a text before now. The argument here would be that the original text, the embedded text, if it cannot be changed, it shouldn't have an effect on the external story. However, as a postmodernist text, although the original text cannot theoretically be changed, that doesn't mean that the characters don't edit the original story because they don't want certain parts to be added in. And we see that a lot with the character of Vladek when he is talking to his son Art. Because as you see here, he says, "But this is what I just told you about Lucia, and so I don't want you should write this in your book." And he's saying, "What? Why? Why am I not allowed to tell this part of the story?" And there's a whole reasoning behind this, which we don't need to engage with now. But the important part here is the fact that Vladek is telling his story, and the events of his story can't change because the events are cast in stone. However, they can still be edited by Art because Art can still choose of what he wants to put into MAUS and what he doesn't want to put into MAUS, or what Vladek asks him not to put in MAUS. So if we look at this from a modernist or a pre-postmodernist perspective, we look at it as in the sense that the embedded text is stuck, it is lost in history, it's recorded in concrete, and the only thing that can change is the fabula, which is the story that surrounds it. However, when we are looking at this from a postmodernist text, we go, although the embedded text is historical and technically it cannot be edited because events can't change, going back to thinking about Inglourious Bastards, and we go, well, Inglourious Bastards isn't true because Hitler was murdered in the film. Here's the same thing. We need to go, okay, so the historical events are cast in stone, but what parts might be being left out, and how is this narrative being edited for us, for our understanding, for our cohesion, for the structuring of the narrative? And there are moments when Arch Bingaman himself, as the artist, recognizes this, and he says, I am telling the story because although it may not be 100% accurate, the sentiment or the emotion and the growth of the characters is in fact accurate. Okay, so this is quite a dense section. I understand if this is one of those sections you might need to go through a couple of times, and it is definitely one of those sections where you should discuss in depth with your lecturers. So before we go on to the next set of slides, I want you to please make sure that you read the reading on VC Learn, which is called Postmodern Themes and Tropes from the Complete MAUS. And it's really important that you make sure you do read that, because that section is quite heavily informs the next section of our set of slides. Okay, thanks guys, and good luck.